So now we're going to talk a little bit about gender nonconforming and transgender youth, and a little bit about their families, because they're an important piece of that puzzle. An important thing in working with trans youth and their families is understanding the impact of societal expectations, particularly on parents. Kids get it from the very beginning, but parents really hold the bulk of it. So parents of gender nonconforming kids, they're often held responsible for what their kids do, and society has a tendency to blame them if their kids are not gender appropriate. Some parents, because they feel the pressure to do this, to raise their kids a certain way, will resort to abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. That's certainly not all parents, and the recent studies are showing that the parents who are very supportive of their kids have much better outcomes. But there are certainly people who have struggled with this stuff because gender is such a powerful force, and our ideas about gender roles are that they may resort to certain things to try and get their kids to behave properly. They also may be very disgusted by their child's gender presentation. We find this a lot with dads with their boys who present feminine, that they struggle with that and what they expected for their kid. They may kick older children out of their homes. They also, there are a lot of parents who affirm their kids' gender, and those who do may be criticized, ostracized, and blamed. It's not uncommon for CPS to be called on a parent because they're allowing their child to socially transition. So for kids who don't fit the binary, they may try to hide their true gender identity, and in doing so, the outcomes for them is pretty poor. That leads to depression, anxiety. There's research that shows that 50% will attempt suicide, higher rates of substance abuse, self-mutilation, and risky sexual behavior. You see this a lot in the LGBT, the lesbian gay community as well, when they're not supported or they're being bullied or harassed in school. Children who cannot hide their experience of gender get harassment at the hands of peers, teachers, parents, and they have a higher level of homelessness, and also they can engage in prostitution as a survival mechanism, especially if they get kicked out of the house. Children who have expressed transgender identity and nonconformity in grades K through 12, there's a study, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force that just came out, it was done in 2011, found that these kids 78% of them reported alarming rates of harassment. 35% were physically assaulted at school. 12% experienced sexual violence. Harassment was so severe in schools that 1/6, 15% had to leave school. And I can tell you a lot of the parents I work with remove their kids from schools that are transgender because they're being harassed and they can't protect them any other way, so they end up homeschooling them. Children who have been harassed and abused by teachers in K through 12 settings show dramatically worse health and other outcomes than those who did not experience those abuse. So the teacher, that is even more damaging for those kids. So a little bit more about sex and gender, just for kids, and this is a little bit about the intersex community. We have chromosomes, XX and XY, XX being female, XY being male. But it's important to know that there are actually about 13 genetic variations of sex that we don't actually acknowledge. And many of those people present differently than the standard male or female phenotype, which is your body. Some of them identify as opposite than what their bodies look like. Some identify as both. Your secondary sex characteristics are those things that develop when you get breasts or testes and all that. That's all the stuff that happens in adolescence that really defines your sex. Those are your markers of gender. Given the traditional binary gender developmental model, where males are masculine and they're straight, they like women, and girls are feminine and they like boys. The idea traditionally was that children are born either a boy or a girl. So intersex children are not considered a part of this, and actually they're considered a social crisis. They have to be fixed with surgery right away. They have to be one or the other. And the idea is between 18 and 24 months, their core gender identity is thought to be fixed, and so you have to fix them early. There's been a lot of backlash in the intersex community around this because people have lost their sexuality. They've been assigned to a gender that doesn't fit for them. There's a lot of different kinds of things that have happened. Parents were told to train them to be a particular way. So if it was a boy, traditionally that they turned into a girl because their penis was too small, then they were taught to only let them wear pink and dresses and play with girls' toys, and then they would be socialized as a girl. What we know now is that doesn't work at all, and a lot of people are complaining about these early surgeries on kids. There are now doctors that are beginning to challenge those ideas. That's a good movement for them. In the preschool years, children learn how to act, feel, dress, and perform as a boy, girl through socialization. This is part of the normal process, supposedly. This is how you learn your appropriate roles. By age 6, if all goes normally, a child is both heterosexual and gender normative. So that's the traditional model. The new model is one that's a little more accurate to what we actually see in the world, particularly those of us who work with gender nonconforming kids, is that it's fluid. You know, that kids do switch their gender after 24 months and they're doing fine. Gender development does not appear to stop at age 6, but it goes on from birth to death. We move through gender in very different ways. You might even notice with heterosexual couples, as they get older, they start to look alike. That they start dressing in more similar ways, that the women don't look quite as feminine, the men don't look quite as masculine, and that there's ways in which those things shift for people, no matter who they are. Children are telling adults their gender as young as toddlers. This is true. There's a lot of kids, particularly the kids with more body dysphoria, are stating who they are much younger, and parents are beginning to listen to this. What we also know is that gender is focused in the mind and brain and not what's in between the legs. Important stuff in this is the research that's been done on the brain, and also what we know about development of sex, that a lot of it happens prenatally, and that it has to do with different times that hormones are influencing the development of the brain and of the genitals, and that oftentimes the brain, what they're finding is the brain of transgender folks is more similar to that, particularly transsexual folks, more similar to that of the opposite gender. So their brain develops in one way and their body in another, which is where we get the dysphoria. The expression of gender characteristics, and including identities that are not stereotypically associated with one's assigned sex at birth, is common and culturally diverse human phenomenon that should not be judged as inherently pathological or negative. That was a statement made by W. Path. I think that's an important one. So one way to think about gender, rather than think about it on those lines that we were talking about, is to think about it as a web. And it's a web that includes a lot of different things. It involves chromosomes, hormones, hormone receptors, gonads, primary sex characteristics, the secondary sex characteristics, your brain, your mind, socialization, such as family, school, community, culture, values, ethics, laws, theories, and practices. All of that stuff goes in to create the gendered being that you are. So a few other things to know, terms that we talk about with kids, and it's true of everybody, is there's this idea of a true gender self, and that's one's authentic internal gender identity, how you really see yourself. And then there's this false gender self. It's the gender presentation that you develop that is meant to protect that true gender self, and it's a way to comply with social norms. So you'll see kids who try really hard to be what their assigned sex is so that they can fit in, that everybody will love them, that they'll be accepted, and at some point that doesn't work anymore. Sometimes it doesn't happen until they're adults that they actually have to shift things, but at some point, if they're transgender or transsexual, they often come into conflict with this false self and the true self. And I would say that really finding a lot of the work is helping people to find their authentic, true gender self. There's also this idea of gender creativity, which is sort of the weaving together of the unique and authentic gender self based on one's identity and their chosen gender expression. So it's that special way that each person develops their gender. And it's like a thumbprint in many ways. Although, unlike a thumbprint, it's variable and can change over time. So there's a lot of ways in which kids present, and I'm not going to go into all of the different ways that they show up, but just to say that kids are really fluid in their gender presentation, and they have different ways. There are some kids that are transgendered. They're very often very binary. They know that they're the opposite of their assigned gender. They're very clear about that. There are other kids that are very fluid. They kind of float back and forth, and you never quite know where they're going to land. And they may end up growing up to be what's considered gender normative heterosexual folks, but they have a gender fluid childhood. There are kids who kind of do a mixture of the two. Some kids have called themselves gender Prius, sort of gender one in the front, another in the back, or Taurus, like the idea of having one gender on the bottom and one on the top. There's ways in which they think about these things that are very different. There are some kids that are express a sort of a gender non-conforming behavior that are actually going to grow up to be gay or lesbian. There are some kids that just don't want to declare anything. They might be gender queer or gender smoothies, in which they blend it all together, they mix and match. And there are some kids who are what we call proto-transgender children who may first present as a sexual identity. So you see this a lot in the lesbian community where, or FTM spectrum folks, where they will identify as lesbian first because there's a place for masculine women there, and then realize that doesn't really fit, and then they decide to transition to male. So some of the things that happen when kids are young, the issue is around dress. Gender is about how you dress. So we talk about social transition in kids before puberty because they are, that's what works for them. When you hit puberty, a whole set of other issues come up, particularly for kids who are transgender. And this is really where things separate quite a bit, where people who may be growing up to be gay or lesbian, they tend to be okay with their bodies as they go through puberty. Now, this isn't true of every transgender person, but there are quite a few that when adolescence hits, it becomes a really horrible time because you can no longer pretend that your body is something different or that it matches your brain. So what happens is you get unwanted secondary sex characteristics. Kids during this time become more isolated, they get confused, there's a lot of social anxiety. You get a high rate of anxiety with these kids because they can't function out there and they're not being seen, and it's like torture to be constantly called by a gender that doesn't fit for you because now your body is showing everybody that this is who you are, and it doesn't match. Physical education, sex education, and dating become torture for adolescents in this stage because there's no way, it's all related to your gender, and it doesn't fit. So it's a constant reminder of how you don't fit. Many transgender youth feel betrayed by their bodies, and they will try and hide the changes under loose clothing or tight undergarments. They may go so far as to try and remove their unwanted sex organs or abusing hormones. So they'll do things to try and change their bodies. There's a process. This is true for both adults and for adolescents, and adolescents look much more like adults. So if you look at the DSM categories, they separate kids, or gender identity disorder in children, from gender identity disorder in adolescents and adults. Because once kids hit adolescence, what we find is that the rate of concordance with them staying with the belief that they are the opposite gender sticks pretty strongly. Before puberty, it's kind of fluid and they can go a lot of different directions. But once you hit, especially once you hit about 15 or 16, when somebody says that's who they are, they're probably not going to change their minds. It's about almost 100% that they stick with that. So the process for kids in coming out around having a transgender identity is first they have to become aware that they're different, that this is actually an issue. I've had a lot of kids that go on the internet because they're confused about things, and then they start finding information about these different ideas, and suddenly they come across something that fits for them. People who talk about stories that are very much like theirs. And that part of that is seeking information and reaching out. So they start looking for more stuff, reaching out to other people in the community if they can find them. And then comes the most traumatizing part for most kids is disclosing to significant others, particularly parents. they're most scared about talking to parents, particularly when we're talking about adolescents. This is true also for adults, but I'll kind of go through this with adults a little bit later. Then they explore their identity, and they figure out how to label themselves. And they can move all over the place with that, trying to figure out what terms really fit for them. If they're transgender or transsexual, then they start thinking about issues of body modification and how to get hormones. And as a therapist, you'll get brought in at this point to figure out whether they need puberty suppressing hormones, whether they need cross-sex hormones, things like that. And oftentimes, transgender folks come to you for letters to do these kinds of things. Kids, it's more of a process. For adults, they kind of come in two different ways. And then in the end, it's really integration and acceptance of who they are and expressing it to other people. So one of the important things to know also is parents have very little influence over their children's gender identity, but they have a lot of influence over their health. And the studies show time and time again now that the more we get that kids who have supportive parents do much better on mental health, physical health, all the way across the board. They're doing much better.